when I tell you Dr. Umar is speaking out, and when I tell you he is speaking, honey, he is speaking. The black man is speaking out. Y'all got to see this. He is talking about we need to march in Oceanside, Mississippi. I mean, he's not coming here to play. He's letting us know Mississippi, the police, the DA, the medical examiner, none of them is to be trusted, okay? He's letting us know that these clear white boys has something to do with it. They all fake. He's shutting down Branham Tatum. When I tell you, go Dr. Umar, go, okay? I want y'all to check this out. Let me know what y'all think.
People on that boat. He know it should have been 8 people on that boat. So he said like 7 because he didn't want to say 7 so nobody can ask him where the hell was Nolan. Nolan's life was taken between 3:30 and 4:30, and they know exactly how and who. They know exactly how and who, Art. And they took the phone and the keys to get rid of any evidence. They took the phone and the keys to get rid of any evidence. And if Sister Christine and Sister Tashima didn't go to that girl's house to get that phone, they would have discarded it, Art. They were going to discard the keys in the phone and act like they never even had them either. Now, I'm going to give you this one piece, Art, and I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to give you this one piece, Art, and I'm going to leave it alone. As I said, I'm very disappointed in the fact that Sheriff Ledbetter and District Attorney Morath are not investigating all 30 of those children. I'm disappointed that all 3 boats were not treated like a crime scene.
There is a theory that changes the entire shape of the Nolan Wells case. Not simply that Nolan drowned, but that the drowning may have been the final step in a much larger sequence. Because if Nolan was already dead before entering the water, then the central question changes completely. It is no longer only how did Nolan drown, it becomes who knew what happened before the water ever became part of the story. July 4th was supposed to end with friends returning home from Horn Island. Instead, 18-year-old Nolan Wells never came back. His friends returned, Nolan didn't. 2 days later, his body was found. Since then, one timeline has dominated the case. Nolan was last seen during the afternoon. An emergency call came from the boat. The boat eventually left the island without him, and the official explanation has focused heavily on drowning. But there are still questions surrounding the final hours. The 3:30-4:30 window, the emergency call, Nolan's phone, the other boats, and an autopsy that has not publicly answered everything. Dr. Umar believes those unanswered questions deserve a much deeper look, and tonight we're going back through them. July 4th, Horn Island, Mississippi. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He had gone to the island with friends for the holiday. The day was crowded, multiple boats were present, dozens of people were moving through the area. And that matters because Nolan did not disappear inside an empty environment. There were people. There were boats, there were potential witnesses, and there were multiple versions of Nolan's final afternoon. But before examining the theories, there is one thing that has to be established: the timeline. The timeline is where this case begins to become difficult. According to the timeline discussed by Dr. Umar, several different accounts place Nolan in the area during the afternoon. One reported conversation with Katie stretched between approximately 3:00 and 4:30. Another reported sighting placed Nolan earlier, and another account reportedly had him seen around 3:40. That creates a narrowing window, not proof of homicide, not proof of an accident, but a window investigators have to reconstruct.
One of the reasons that Katie is making her window so wide is she trying to leave a little bit of wiggle room for Warren and them to get their story straight, allegedly. I think Katie trying to leave a little bit of wiggle room for Warren and them to get their story straight, Art. Now, according to our sister Christine, and my heart goes out to Sister Christine, Nolan's mother. My heart deeply, deeply goes out to you, Queen. According to Christine, Art, she heard from a coach who ran into Nolan on the island as well. And according to the coach, he spoke to Nolan between 2:30 and 3:30. So Javon didn't see him after 3:40. The coach spoke to him sometime between 2:30 and 3:30. And Katie said her conversation with Nolan was between 3 and 4:30. So you know what that means, Art? We can pretty much digest, conclude.
The significance of that timeline is simple. If those accounts are accurate, they place Nolan's final known movements inside a relatively narrow period. And then comes the next timestamp, 4 o'clock. Because while the timeline surrounding Nolan was becoming uncertain, a completely different emergency was unfolding. The boat was reportedly taking on water. The bilge pump had failed. Someone needed help. And a call went out to CTAL. That call was recorded.
I knew the white liberals on YouTube were going to run with it. I knew the white racists on YouTube were going to run with it. and everybody in between. It hurts my heart for Sister Christine, Nolan's mother, to have to see so many people using her son's name and crisis and tragedy for clickbait. And that's one of the biggest reasons I kind of stood back. It almost reminded me of the Freddie Gray police unaliving in Baltimore back during the Barack Obama era. When Freddie Gray lost his life to those police in Baltimore, everybody rushed to Baltimore. They did the same thing with Michael Brown in Ferguson, not because they necessarily cared about the tragedy, but because they wanted to benefit personally from it. And so I stayed away from Ferguson. I stayed away from Baltimore.
The call establishes something important. There really was a reported emergency, but it doesn't automatically explain Nolan's disappearance. The boat eventually continued moving. And at approximately 4:31, according to the timeline being discussed, the boat left Horn Island. Nolan was not aboard. Now, the story had two separate clocks. One clock tracked the boat, the other tracked Nolan. And they did not end at the same place. This is where the investigation becomes much more complicated. Because if Nolan remained on the island after the boat departed, then investigators have to establish what happened between his last confirmed sighting and that departure. But if Nolan actually returned toward the boat, or was somewhere else entirely, the timeline changes again. This is why witness accounts matter. And this is also why Nancy Grace has argued that the investigation should not simply be closed before those questions are answered.
I think that it is very murky. And I do not understand, Stephen, the demands on all platforms for the investigation to be shut down. Is it possible Nolan Wells died by accident? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that there was foul play? Yes, that is possible. And I don't believe the investigation should be shut down until we know the answer to that. I have two children, both the age of Nolan Wells. I would be lying on the courthouse steps screaming for justice if the investigation into a death related to them was shut down before I had answers.
Nancy's position is not that foul play has been proven. Her point is almost the opposite. The evidence has not established enough certainty to stop asking questions. And that distinction becomes especially important when the medical evidence enters the picture. The first major medical question is drowning. Finding someone in water does not automatically answer every question about how they died. A body recovered days later has already been affected by time, water, and decomposition. And the first autopsy contains information that may not be completely reproducible later. That is where Dr. Kesha Davis becomes important.
Water, are those due to, drowning? And can we say that, or is it undetermined? There was a Finnish study, and that study unfortunately said that about 16% of those bodies found in water were undetermined, where we couldn't say they drowned in the water or they were unalive before they were put in the water, right? That's the problem. And same thing in this case. We don't have the stories to say the person truly drowned. We weren't there. We can't speak to Nolan Wells, and the other individuals are not necessarily speaking. So that's where the problem goes to the autopsy. And we want the autopsy to say, is there water in the lungs? Is this definitely a drowning? Well, the body was recovered not directly after, right? It's a couple of days. And so therefore you're dealing with decomp. And then the first autopsy is sealed. So what do? You have the second autopsy who got the lungs that are cut up. So the water in the lungs, you can't necessarily see that when the lungs have been dissected through, which is the normal procedure anyway. So being undetermined, yeah, it can happen. It definitely can happen in it. And that's where I think people don't understand we're a chapter in the story.
The second autopsy can provide an important independent perspective, but it can also face limitations if material from the first examination is no longer available. And that became one of the most discussed forensic issues surrounding Nolan's case.
And that's a great question. And Dr. Judy Melinek had said this in a post that the second autopsy literally is hindered. It's like blindfolding yourself, and now you got to figure out to go through a maze. You probably saw it in a flash. You got 10 seconds to see it. Now you got to figure it out. That's what the second autopsy is, literally. The first autopsy, they have every right, because this is their jurisdiction, to do the best that they can, right? Dissect the organs. So when we do dissection, I want to step back just a second. We do a dissection, right? We have to take all the organs out and look at them in block. So for instance, if there was something in the larynx, or in the throat. When they are cutting through to look through everything, that's going to be dislodged, right? If they're concerned about someone getting strangulated, that's taken out as a block, and that's why the second autopsy didn't have it. So he has to wait for the first autopsy. But things that you see on first initial examination, when you're cutting up the organs, because we slice them, what we call bread loafing. We slice the organs thinly to look for things. Maybe there was something lodged in there. Maybe there was there's changes like of drowning. Maybe there was actually break of the hyoid bone, which can be seen with strangulation. But the second forensic pathologist has to wait.
This is where the story needs to slow down, because missing forensic material does not automatically mean something suspicious happened, but it can mean that certain questions are harder for a second examiner to answer. And that matters when the public is trying to determine whether drowning alone explains everything. Another detail became part of the public debate, the reddish discoloration described around the back of Nolan's head. Online, such findings can quickly become labeled as a bruise, but pathology is more complicated than that. A visible mark can have more than one possible explanation.
I want to ask you about this discoloration to the back of his neck. Is it common for decomposition to mimic bruising to that degree?
So decomposition can do a lot of things based on the stage. We're talking about the stage, the time, right? The temperature, the water, the conditions that the body was in. Was the body moved? So this is what he said. And people are equating a bruise, an actual bruise contusion that happens while you're living, right, to what he said was red discoloration, right? So you have a sign, you have something you see. And now what could be the cause of that sign could be multiple things. We do it in medicine all the time. We have a finding. Now, what caused that finding? And multiple things can lead to the same thing. It's a redness in the back of the head. Yes, it was a nice size amount. He put the size on there. However, he said two things. If you look on top of the skin, there was no breakage of the skin, which would have been another clue to help us say, oh, yes, somebody must have hit him. There's a laceration. Then underneath that red discoloration, the bone was not broken. There was no fractures. He had even looked additionally in other parts of the body where the overlying skin didn't show anything of concern, just to make sure he didn't see any fractures. That doesn't mean anything did not happen to this individual. It means that the red discoloration, we cannot necessarily say it was a contusion due to someone hitting him or was post-mortem.
That distinction is crucial. The discoloration alone does not prove Nolan was struck. It does not prove he was attacked. But it also cannot simply be interpreted without considering the surrounding evidence. And that brings the case back to the most basic forensic question. Was Nolan alive when he entered the water? Or had something already happened before that? Dr. Davis explains why that question cannot be answered from one clue alone.
Is there, in pathology, any forensic method? I know you said that you're not a forensic pathologist, but I'm asking to ask. Is there any method that can help establish whether or not Nolan Wells was unconscious before or after entering the water?
What they see in the lungs, it can. Now, this is the problem sometimes where pathologists in general or forensics can disagree, right? Based on the same findings, are you saying textbook that that the person was alive, there's fluid in the lungs, right? So if you unalive before and then you're put in the water, technically, the same changes you see with a drowning, you won't see, like changes of fluid in the actual alveolar spaces, maybe some frothy fluid in the upper airways or stuff like that. But the first autopsy has that information. So there is a possibility you can tell the difference between the two. The problem is that nothing's 100%. So let's say 90% of the people, you will see these changes of the person unalived in the water, meaning it was a drowning. But what if there is a chance that you see these findings and they're not totally clear, but the person actually unalived before? So you see, it's a gray zone. So you have to take multiple clues to get to the answer. Not one clue by itself, but multiple. The more clues you have that suggest it, then we can say it's compatible with or consistent with the person drowning. Now, here's something that I just say. Someone can drown. This is why you need a story, right? Someone can drown in the water. That doesn't mean that somebody contributed to it. Somebody can drown, and without the stories, what if people were watching him drown? That's still a crime. What if somebody may have pushed down with the head? What are we going to see in the autopsy? Nothing. So that's why the autopsy is as good as the story that comes with it.
And this creates an important boundary around the conspiracy theory. The forensic evidence may support possibilities, but possibilities still need a timeline. They need witnesses. They need physical evidence. They need corroboration. And that's where Dr. Umar's argument returns, because Nolan's physical location isn't the only mystery. His phone became another piece of the timeline. Questions have been raised about where it was, who had it, and what digital evidence might exist. But there is an important distinction here. A phone being found somewhere does not automatically establish criminal intent. The real question is whether its data can establish Nolan's movements. Life 360, Snapchat, location information, messages, deleted data. Each can potentially add another timestamp. And Nancy Grace specifically raised the importance of examining those digital inconsistencies.
His phone.
Okay. His phone, rather. His phone was on the boat or whatever, which brings me to this question, because there were some questions about these conflicting stories coming out in the case of him staying behind to talk to a girl, a cell phone date, and inconsistencies between Life 360 and Snapchat locations. Talk about that for a quick second before I let you get on out of here, Nancy.
I certainly will. I've consulted with digital forensics experts, and they say that there can be a difference between Snapchat location and Life 360 location and your iPhone, Find My iPhone location.
Yes.
So we have to make these things jive, and we may learn something nefarious or not. Now, we're also being told that there was no cell coverage there. I don't believe that, because the young man out on the boat called Cito, and I could hear him just fine. So there was cell. So the mom was concerned. She didn't see any Snapchat or anything going on during this certain period of time. So we have to, and you can look, Stephen, even if you delete and you delete it from deleted and it's not stored in the cloud, can still find out if something was deleted, because it leaves a trail. Everything you do on your phone leaves a trail, even if it's totally deleted.
If the digital records can be reconciled, they could help establish where Nolan actually was. If they cannot be reconciled, that doesn't automatically mean someone manipulated, but it does mean investigators have another discrepancy. And then there is the question of the other boats. This is where Dr. Umar's theory becomes broader. He has argued that investigators should not focus exclusively on one boat, because there were other vessels, other people, other potential witnesses, and potentially other locations relevant to Nolan's final movements. Nancy Grace also questioned the need to establish exactly who was present and what each person could have seen.
I would like to get my hands on that GPS nav system. I would like to find out if cadaver dogs were brought onto the boat. I would like to get a hold of Katie and question her. And I would like to ask each one of the boys separately what happened. And I'd like to give them a polygraph.
That question is bigger than any single suspect. Who was there? Who saw Nolan? Who saw the boats leave? Who could confirm the timeline? And who has information investigators still need? The answers could strengthen the accident theory, or they could expose gaps that deserve further investigation. Now the theory becomes clearer. Dr. Umar has publicly raised the possibility that Nolan may not have simply drowned by accident. His theory includes the possibility that Nolan was already dead before entering the water. He has also raised the possibility that Nolan's body could have been moved, and he has questioned whether all relevant boats and people received the same investigative scrutiny. But the strength of a theory depends on what evidence can support it. So instead of starting with the conclusion, look at the questions first. The timeline, the emergency call, the phone, the other boats, the autopsy, and the gap between what is known and what remains uncertain. Then Dr. Umar returns to the central theory.
That it took Nolan Wells' body 41 hours before we saw it, I think that body might have gotten dumped, Art. I think they might have held onto Nolan Wells' body and dumped it a day or two later. And that's why the other two boats are important to the investigation, Art. How do we know Nolan wasn't unalived on one boat and held on a second boat? How do we know that? How do we know a second boat didn't take Nolan Wells' corpse to one of them other islands and then the body floated back, Art? Why are we not investigating all three boats and all 30 white children? Art, I'm going to tell you like this. For that boy to not tell that Cito operator how many people was on that boat, and she asked him 3 times, and the fact he lied and said there was no adults, and then he still didn't answer her question and said everybody under 21, and she had to repeatedly say that was not my question.
That is the core of the theory. Not that every person on those boats was involved, not that homicide has been proven, but that the investigation may need to consider the entire environment rather than one isolated vessel. And that leads to the most disturbing possibility. What if Nolan's death did not begin where his body was eventually found? There is another explanation. The boat really could have experienced a mechanical emergency. Nolan could have chosen to stay behind. The different witness accounts could simply reflect imperfect memories. The phone could have been left behind innocently. The audio could contain nothing more than panic, confusion, and background noise. And the medical findings could ultimately support an accidental drowning. That possibility has to remain open, because an unresolved death should not be turned into a conviction through narration. The evidence has to do that. And this is precisely where Dr. Kesha Davis's warning about speculation becomes important.
Here's two. I'm a mother, by the way. I am a mother of a young adult male, and I completely am with the family. At the end of the day, there could be some wrongdoing or not wrongdoing, but every time we speculate and add on to the story, imagine the pain that a family member is going through. That's what we think about. We want to be sleuths. I understand it. We are angry. I understand it. But the more you speculate, the more pain you are adding. So think about that before you speculate. In addition to that, if you are trying to do a deep dive, get an expert like TMZ is doing. Get somebody that can tell you the process, because sometimes most of the disinformation or misinformation is because people don't understand the basics of science. And I don't expect you to. Most doctors don't go into the autopsy room and understand what we do, right? The neck being missing was a big thing that people were.
That is the line this investigation has to walk. The public wants answers, the family deserves answers, but the difference between an unanswered question and proof of homicide is enormous. So where does that leave the Nolan Wells case? With a timeline that still demands attention. Nolan was seen during the afternoon. A distress call came around 4 p.m. The boat eventually left Horn Island. Nolan did not return with it. His body was recovered later. His phone became part of the investigation. Multiple boats and witnesses remain relevant to reconstructing the afternoon, and the medical evidence has generated questions about what can and cannot be determined. None of that proves Dr. Umar's theory, but it explains why the theory continues to exist. Because the central question has never really been, did Nolan drown? The deeper question is, what happened before Nolan entered the water? That is the question investigators have to answer. And until they can reconstruct those final movements with evidence, the case remains surrounded by uncertainty. Maybe Nolan became separated from his friends. Maybe a tragic accident followed. Maybe the emergency on the boat was exactly what it appeared to be. Or maybe the final explanation will require investigators to look beyond one boat, one timeline, and one version of events. The water gave no one back. But it did not give the public the complete story. And somewhere between the final sighting, the emergency call, the departing boats, the missing phone, and the autopsy, there is still a sequence of events waiting to be fully reconstructed. Until that happens, the biggest mystery isn't what people online believe. It's what the evidence can actually prove. If you think Nolan's final timeline deserves a deeper investigation, tell me what matters most. The 3:30, 4:30 window, the CTEL call, the phone, the other boats, or the autopsy.